All right. How many of you have seen this movie? Very good. Very good. Excellent. Well, there's a lot more to add to it. And both Noe and I, back last year on November 8th, we had the privilege of speaking at a special UFO conference that marked the 40th anniversary of the Travis Walton UFO incident of 1975, which took place near the rural town of Eber, Arizona. The event made international news after Travis's 6 companions reported to law enforcement that they saw Travis get hit by a beam of light from a saucer-shaped object hovering in a nearby forest clearing. Travis' incredible experience is often called the best documented UFO abduction case in history, and now he's going to tell you all the latest information about what happened to him in 1975. Just a side note, he knows Spanish, so he knows a couple cuss words, so don't get him angry. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our great friend and gentleman, Mr. Travis Walton.
He taught me all the naughty Spanish I know.
You want to give him a lesson?
No lessons on that tonight. Wow, you know, after 40 years, it amazes me that there's still new discoveries being made in relation to what happened. I'm going to just run through what happened before I get into that, but there's a lot of new stuff and, you know, some other developments. But November 5th, 1975. To us, it was just an ordinary work day. We're just heading out to work. We had no idea how the day would end. We were putting in some pretty long days because, you know, winter weather was going to shut us out of the woods pretty quick. So we wanted to finish up the contract before snows hit. So we worked till dark and loaded up the equipment. We're headed home. And, you know, in the movie, it gives the impression that we'd been driving a long time and everybody is dozing off to sleep. But in reality, we were all wide awake, just wired from, you know, heavy physical exertion that we'd just been doing, cutting trees and piling logs and heavy lifting, you know. So we were in a very alert state of mind, and I was sitting by the door in the front. Ken Peterson was in the middle, Mike was driving, and there was 4 guys in the back of the truck. And so I was in a good position to notice the glimmers of light coming through the trees, being one of the first ones to see it, I assume. But, you know, it wasn't all alarming at first. It wasn't like, oh, wow, what is that the minute I saw it? It was just, what the heck is that? You know, in the woods, you know, normally it's just dark and you don't see much of anything. So, but here's this glow coming through the trees, little glimmers here and there, and I'm thinking, what could that be, you know? And then, that don't look right. And, you know, one by one, all these little conversations amongst the crew dropped off, so I figured they were looking where I was looking, but nobody really said anything at first because it was just kind of curious. I was thinking, maybe deer hunters, because, you know, we'd actually heard some shooting in the distance during the day. It was deer hunting season. But the glow was coming from higher than where I knew ground level would be. It was pretty thick growth of trees through there at that time. This was a part of the contract we hadn't got to yet. But some of the guys said that they were thinking, could that be the moon? You know, and then you look over in a different direction and see the moon. Well, that isn't it. You know, it's not campers. What could that be? You know, we had stopped on the way to work a time or two and seen where a tree had been hit by lightning and was on fire high up above the ground. We stopped and put it out because Mogollon Rim area is the highest point for miles around there, and it's got the highest number of lightning strikes of any place in the continental United States except for the Everglades. So, you know, there are places that you can walk, and if you're looking at a tree that's been hit by lightning, you can see the next one that's been hit, you know. These big rips through the bark that just kind of explode through there. When that lightning comes down through there, it turns that sap to steam, and it just blasts a crack out of the side of the tree that's kind of generally spirals down the tree. So I was thinking it might be one of those, and that's where the idea of the fire, could that be a forest fire? And that's where the title of the movie, Fire in the Sky, came from. But then I said, well, Mike, what is that? And everybody was saying, well, what could that be? We thought about maybe a plane crash or something, Sometimes, very often on a light plane, the craft doesn't even fall all the way to the ground. It just gets hung up in the trees. I said, Mike, because they're up ahead on this little dirt track we were on, you could see where the light was coming across the road ahead. And I was thinking that, there was a break in the trees there, and at that point we'd be able to see where the light was coming from. I said, Mike, hurry up, get up there, let's see what it is. And just as soon as we got to where that light was crossing the road, boom, there it was. It was just unmistakable. Our famous UFO skeptic said, oh, they probably just saw the planet Jupiter, No, this was no little point of light off in the sky. I mean, less than 100 feet away, as close as from here to the back of the room, there it was. A metallic disc hovering there, outlined against the sky. Alan was in the back, Alan Dallas. I think he was next to the door. And he yelled out, it's a flying saucer or a spaceship, something like that. Immediately, there was no mistaking what we're looking at. It was incredible. And I was immediately thinking that this thing would take off. So even as, I said, Mike, stop the truck, because where he was sitting, it was kind of up the hill, and he couldn't really see what we were looking at. But when I yelled, stop the truck, he stopped, like, what's going on? And he actually stopped kind of quick. And I just threw open the door, and, the momentum of the truck stopping just swung it open. And I, just on impulse, got out and headed towards this thing. There's been a lot of times when we were driving and, you spot something like a wild animal, a deer or a bear or something, and you say, hey guys, look, before they can even look, it's gone, And so that was my thinking, that this thing would take off. And I jumped out and started towards it, and it was just an impulse. Now, Alan said it looked like he was, had this compulsion to go towards it. And Steve said he thinks I was under their control, under their mind control. And I'm telling these guys, no, it was just this impulse I had. Now, they counter with, well, if they have mind control, they can make you think it's your idea too. So, but to me, it just seemed like, an impulse. I'll go look at it. And then when they got alarmed and they were, getting real anxious about what I was doing, I was scared. I'm not trying to pretend that I was being extremely brave. I was being extremely foolish. But they started, yelling at me to get back in the truck. And actually, that kind of egged me on, because at that point I could hear the fear in their voices too. We were all scared, but I was determined to show that I wasn't. But I started to move not so quickly in that direction. I got to thinking that this could be dangerous, so I slowed down, and when I got closer to it, the closer I got, the more I could hear of the sound. They could hear the high points. The high points carried better than the low points, but it was a real complex mixture of sounds. It was a cyclic, metallic sort of a sound, kind of if you had, like when you pass a knife over a sharpener or something, it makes that kind of a sound, kind of a scraping, only more filled with that frequency. And then an undulating sort of a real complex set of tones. And then there was this rumble that, Mike said he could feel it in the steering wheel of the truck. And I could feel it in my body. It was such a low tone that it was, I was actually feeling it more than hearing it. And as I got to where, you know, I was looking up at about, like a 45-degree angle, I couldn't get much closer because there was this big pile of logging debris that had been piled in the middle of the clearing. They do this in strips through these contracts so that you can wait till the snow covers the ground, then go in there and burn them, and it gets rid of a lot of the fuel that any forest fire would have coming through that area, and it makes it an easier place to fight the fire, generally along roads, you know, so you can get equipment in there. So the idea was fuel reduction for forest fire prevention. But so there, the UFO was beyond where the slash pile was, but I was standing there looking up at it, and it was awesome. Just it gave this feeling of power and mystery in a way that it's just hard to describe. You know, John described it as being scary and beautiful at the same time. He compared it to a new Ferrari or something, you know? And several of the guys described it that way, as beautiful and scary at the same time. It was shaped like two metallic discs, like a pie pan in shape. Two of them put lip to lip, a little dome on top. And it was smooth as glass, and parts of it were metallic and parts of it were glowing. They weren't windows, but these sections gave off this sort of pale golden color. Kind of like a harvest moon, kind of when the moon is real low on the horizon, you know, not real light. So when we said it looked like molten metal, I was talking about molten metal coming out of a blast furnace where it's almost white hot, you know, and the movie people interpreted that as looking like molten lava, so they had all this reddish color, but it wasn't reddish. But it's still, you know, when you think you might be seeing a forest fire, you know, the flames can be, you know, flame colored, light yellow. So I was looking up at it, and those guys were getting more and more scared, you know, swearing at me, calling me all kinds of names, and wanting me to get back in the truck. And I was, you know, leaning that way real heavy, but suddenly it got louder and it started to move. And so I just dove for cover, just kind of a reflex. There was a log sticking up there, and I got down behind the log. The log was sticking out of the pile, so it was up, you know, to where I could actually squat down behind it. And those, they were saying, let's go, let's go. And so I decided to stand up and run back to the truck. And right when I stood up is when I felt this shock go through my body, like I'd raised up underneath something, like I'd been hit by a truck. It felt like a physical blow, and kind of like when you touch a spark plug wire. I mean, like a real shock. And sometimes when you're running a chainsaw and it's just raining and your clothes get wet, you can get shocked pretty dang good with a chainsaw spark plug. But I instantly blacked out. I don't know what happened at that point. But Dwayne Smith later got work as a journeyman electrician around industrial applications. And he said it sounded to him like high voltage. And, you know, I recorded an interview with him right before he died, describing this sound of high voltage. It was a sort of a popping sound with this power surge sort of a sound, they said. And it threw me through the air. Steve said like 25 feet, but John said that the way my body fell like a sack of meat, like there were just no bones in my body, you know. that they instantly were screaming, "It killed him, he's dead." I mean, people make fun of them guys and say, "Yeah, you got a bunch of real courageous friends there, you know, run off and leave you like that." But it was perfectly understandable. What sense would it make for them to go and try to rescue somebody who's already dead? And Mike's responsibility was for the safety of the crew. So they just instantly took off. Mike said that some kind of smoke or dust or boiled up around me, and they were certain that, you know, here's this ball of energy. They compared it to, you know, stepping on a landmine or something. It's totally understandable that what they did. And, you know, I will defend those guys. You know, anybody call them cowards. You know, they actually exhibited quite a bit of courage later on. You know, they had the courage, some of them, to come back to try to rescue me. All of them came back. Now in the movie, it shows when they pulled over and Mike said, "Oh, we got to go back." They didn't want to go, and Mike said, "Well, anybody who doesn't want to go back can wait here." In the movie, everybody gets out and waits alone in the dark. Not likely. Even if they didn't want to go back, they were going to stay in that truck, and they did. They all went back to see if they could rescue me. And that takes guts. I mean, at that point, you know, they would have had every excuse to just keep going and get help. So they had quite an argument about whether they were going to find me alive. I mean, they were talking about whether it had incinerated me or disintegrated me, and Steve said no. When he hit the ground, I was looking right at him, and he was in one piece. So when they were driving back, Kenny said the scariest thing to him is how horrible it was going to be to see my charred body laying there. But when they got to the place where they could see the truck had spun out when they took off, no body, you know. They got out of the truck, they said, and went up and looked. They only had one flashlight, so one of them held the flashlight, and they said they were all huddled around that, everybody trying to be in the middle of the group, you know, because it was a very frightening situation, looking around in the dark to see. And every time they move through the trees and catch a glimpse of the moon, they'd think this thing had come back, even though on the way in they had seen it streak off. You got to give them credit for trying. They went back to town, argued about what to do. Some of the guys were in favor of reporting it right away. Alan didn't want the police involved. He'd been in trouble with the law in his life. And he said, well, let's just get some friends with guns and come back, and then if we can't find Travis, well, then we'll report it. But you know, some of the others said, look, if we can't find Travis, ever, you know, how's it gonna look if we don't report this? So when they got into town, they called the local deputy, Chuck Ellison, who was at my 40th anniversary conference. And nobody had ever interviewed him in all this time. That was a first. And he is on this video that's been made called Travis. And it's quite coincidental or ironic that, you know, Chuck Ellison should be found after all these years. He had gone to work for the Phoenix Police Department, Sheriff's Department down there, and it had a major sighting near the military base down there. But it was ironic that we should, at that time, with all the discussion about what was going on, what had happened, and his connection with the sheriff, we didn't know that Sheriff Gillespie had passed away. I just found this out like 2 weeks ago. You know, on July 21st, he passed away and nobody knew. I mean, here we're at a conference in Heber, in the county, a very popular sheriff for all those years, and somehow that was just overlooked. That's just still amazes me that we didn't know that. And so his very last interview is on this film, the Travis video that some of you have already got from me. So when they got into town, Chuck Ellison took the report. And I think his testimony, as a recent development, is actually more relevant than when the sheriff and the undersheriff got there, because it took them over an hour to get there. And Ellison's first impressions was, here's these guys, they just freshly came from seeing what they'd seen. But all of the lawmen, I believe probably even Chuck Ellison, figured something was up, because it was plain that they were shaken. These guys, he said, were white-faced. Some of them were still crying, and something terrible had happened. But being law enforcement people, they tended to think of what kind of a crime could these guys be covering up, and they began to suspect that the men, somebody, one of the crew probably, that there'd been a fight. And, I had been in a fight or two with Alan Dallas, and so had Mike. And Mike and Alan got in a fist fight in the middle of the street in front of my house. But they suspected that the men had murdered me, and were making up the craziest story to cover up for why no one was going to see me again. So during the search, some of the men came out to help. They had over 50 men, some on horseback, four-wheel drives, ATVs. They had airplanes, helicopters, circling, combing the area for miles around. They said that the horses behaved strangely, and some of them actually bolted and got lost in the process. My oldest brother was out there, and he was digging into all the piles the crew had made on that work day, expecting to find my body. There was some people out there with Geiger counters, Mike noticed. And these were guys, they were wearing Forest Service uniforms, but Mike had never seen them before, and he'd been doing Forest Service contracting work for years. And he'd never seen these guys before. He always goes up to the guy with the Geiger counter and says, you fighting anything? He goes, no. And he's not very friendly at all. He says, well, it's ticking. What's that mean? He says, that's just background radiation, see, 1.5. And he held it up to the watch on the guy that was with him, and it went up to 3. He says, see, this radium dial watch will give you a reading of 3. And he says, well, test us. And so he tested Mike and the other crewman, and says, see, still background. Mike says, well, we've bathed and changed our clothes. How about testing the truck? Our hard hats are in the truck. He went back to the truck and got the hard hats, and when he tested it, it went up to a reading of 6. I mean, just sitting in the truck 100 feet away made these hard hats a reading. I mean, one was metal and one was plastic, so whatever was there was double that of a radium dial watch, and they were at 100 feet away. And one of the recent developments that I want to tell you about is kind of interrupting what's going on here, but 15 years after the incident happened, it was noticed that the trees nearest where the craft had come down were much bigger than was expected. So Mike went out there and took a core sample, and the way he did it was to cut from the outside of the tree into the center and take that little slice out. And sure enough, you could count back 15 growth rings. You get 1 ring for each year, and they were many times thicker than the previous 85 years. This tree had doubled in diameter from being an 85-year-old tree to just 15 years later, which is a 100-year-old tree. It had doubled in diameter. These tree rings, with some complex formulas for the volume of a cone, because a tree is actually a cone, not a cylinder, it was calculated that the volume of wood fiber was 36 times what it had been in the previous 85 years. And so it took 15 years for this to be noticed. And still, researchers just go, huh, and nobody followed up on it. Well, in the meantime, we had a giant forest fire that moved through there and killed a lot of the trees. So then Mike had no qualms about cutting off and getting a full cross section. At the time, he didn't want to kill the trees, so he actually carved a piece of wood out of another piece of dead wood on the ground, put it into this pyramid-shaped cut that he had made for the core sample, and then sealed it up with lifetime caulking so the tree wouldn't be injured and it would survive the sampling. Well, now that the tree had already been killed by the forest fire, cutting it off gave a complete cross-section. And I've got a slide here I'd like to show you. A picture of the original core sample that Mike took. There's the crew for getting to advance. This is my view when I got closest to it. Another recent development, on my way to the airport, this is the service station where the men met with Chuck Ellison, Deputy Ellison, and the sheriff's men that night. They were dismantling this building. This service station was active at the time when they met with the sheriff. Now they're taking the roof off and taking it all apart. I don't know where they're going to demolish it or restore it and make a gas station out of it, but I'll find out when I get back. But recent development. There's the sheriff, there's the helicopter. The polygraph examiner, you met him in the introductory video. Well, I'm going to skip over this. This is my initial impression when I woke up, because I was in a lot of pain and my vision was quite blurry. I'm trying to get to the part relevant to what I'm talking about at the moment here. And then we'll come back to this. The tree growth thing is kind of a recent development in terms of the research going on at the site. Sorry, here's some tree rings. In getting a full cross section, it was discovered that this growth effect was predominantly on the side of the tree towards where the craft had been. As you go around the clearing, whether it be in the north, south, west, east side of the tree, whatever was facing the UFO is the part that had the thickened rings. And this is the original sample that was taken that made us think that the trees were generally growing in a accelerated way. Well, this last summer, Ben Hansen supervised this examination, and we found these other trees and found out that this was a directional effect. And that was very interesting because, you know, the skeptics started saying, oh, maybe there was some other reason for accelerated growth. You know, maybe there was extra rainfall, which there wasn't. We were actually going through a drought during that period of time. But Ben Hansen did some research about the Scots pine species of trees that were growing in the forests around the Chernobyl nuclear accident in Russia. And there was a scientific paper that was documenting that those trees had produced wood fiber at 3 times the rate that they had previously. Now, these trees were at some distance from the source of the radiation, and it was generalized. It was all around the perimeter of the tree. But that was additional evidence that, contrary to what you might intuitively expect about the effects of radiation, that it was not going to kill living things, that in the case of pine trees at least, that it would accelerate the growth. Now, Ken Peterson was sitting in the truck right next to me. So when I threw open the door, he was the most exposed crew member to a direct line of sight with the craft. And he has developed skin cancer on his right arm, on the side of the where the UFO was. So that was a pretty dramatic development, and it's ongoing research. We're going to take some more core samples. There have already been some material that was sent to the lab, and one of the scientists that was examining these samples has passed away, and so the baton will be passed on, and we're going to go further into that. After I was returned, I underwent a whole battery of tests. Some of these tests were done with the idea of making sure that I was okay. You know, there was quite a bit of concern about the effects of radiation or, you know, some kind of bizarre infection or something like that, or the effects of that beam of energy hitting me. So I had a thorough medical exam, and one of the things that came out, you know, had an EKG, checking the heart, and x-rays, and all kinds of blood and urine sample testing. But the brainwave scan was interesting because of the intense media attention. I mean, you know, the phone rang continuously at my brother's house, at my mother's house, my family members, at the sheriff's office. I know, calls from all over the world. And so it was very hard to, you know, get this kind of research done because of, you know, the fame and my name. So the doctor had my brainwave done under an assumed name. I went in there, and the technician did not know who I was or what had happened. But that's very good, because it's kind of like a double blind. He's not going to be biased by the perception that he should find something. He's just told to look for signs of injury. So in the EEG report, the brainwave scan, there was an anomalous brainwave pattern that was discovered. Now, I still have that report. The plan with, as far as updating what's new developments, is to have that report examined by a neuroscientist, an expert in this field, in terms of comparing it to perhaps somebody who'd been electrocuted or hit by lightning. And also the plan is to repeat the brainwave scan and see if this pattern was just due to a recent effect that faded away over time, or if it's still there. But the significance of that is a theory that I've come up with about what happened when I regained consciousness. I was in a lot of pain. I didn't know where I was. It seemed hot, but the main thing is I felt something was terribly wrong inside, you know? I felt like I was mortally wounded, like I was dying. And what really fed into that fear, even before I realized where I was the feeling of suffocation. You know, people don't understand the degree of fear that is generated by the feeling of being smothered. The terrorists are interrogated with a technique called waterboarding, which they know about before they're ever captured. They know it's not going to kill them. They know that our guys do it as part of their training, but it still works. And it works because it generates fear in a way that you just can't reason away. And so people who think, oh, I would stay calm, you know, I was on board there, I'd ask good questions, slip a good souvenir in my pocket. But, you know, I reacted out of fear. It was just blind panic because of all these things coming together at one time. The feeling of being injured, the feeling of claustrophobia that's not caused just by the feeling of suffocation, but also by the cramped space. It was so small in there, and humid and dimly lit. So all those things came together to where when I could finally clear my vision and see these creatures standing over me, and these weren't doctors. I thought I was in a hospital, but here was the face of a creature just so close to me. I instantly knew, you know, what had happened. I'd been thinking while I was lying there in pain that maybe I'd been injured in my run back to the truck, that the crew had taken me to the hospital, and that everything was going to be okay. There was this instrument across my chest, and that's all right. You know, I'm in good hands. They're trying to fix me. But I knew something was really wrong. So I saw them, and before I focused my eyes, I thought maybe it was doctors, you know, with a white surgical cap and mask, you know, with just a darker area in between where their eyes would be. But then when I could see them, I just instantly became so hysterical, so adrenaline shot, that I was able to get my arm up. I could hardly move, but I hit out at it, and it was just more of a push than anything. But even as weak as I was, it fell back much easier than I expected. It fell back into the other one, and I just rolled away from it, and the thing they had on my chest fell off. But I was just focused on them, and they were coming around the table, and they were sort of extending their hands towards me. But this feeling came into my head that was excruciating. It was this invasive, sort of a squirmy feeling in my head that, you know, at first time I thought was just the effects of the injury, you know, that I'd been hit by this blast of energy. But I staggered back, and I bumped up against a shelf or a workbench or something behind me, and I just looked quickly to see what I was up against. And I saw these instruments spread out there. I just grabbed the biggest thing I could find and started flailing through the air to keep them from coming any closer. And they were staring. And that feeling of excruciating pain, I think now my theory is that they were trying to control me telepathically, and it wasn't working. They expected it to work, but it wasn't working because of the brain injury that happened when this blast of energy hit me. And I really think that was an accident, not a weapon that was fired at me, and I'll explain why I think that. But this energy could have been just a kind of a charge that builds up as a side effect of the propulsion of these things, or our famous UFO skeptic guy there, he even had a theory that pilots who see UFOs are seeing results of the electrical charge that builds up in the skin of an airplane when it travels through dry air at high speed, that these they've actually measured charges in terms of millions of volts. And so he's thinking that, you know, these sparks or whatever can fly around. The pilot thinks he sees a UFO. But, you know, that was pretty much debunked by physicists. But still, it does document that these kinds of charges can build up. And so there could have been some effect from a craft that travels much faster than an airplane that would generate a kind of an energy that could injure me and prevent them from using this control. At one of my recent talks, a medical doctor came up to me and he said, you know, the reason that they combine the stare with the telepathy effort is because anatomically, the only openings in the skull, other than the spinal cord, are these where the eyes come through the skull in the front. So if they're projecting some kind of energy from their brains, it would come out through the eyes. And they have very big eyes. And to me, that suggests that they come from someplace with a very low level of light in their normal living conditions. So they were not able to control me. And the attempt was painful. So my nightmares for weeks, months after I was returned were about those eyes. When they left the room, I was afraid they would come back. And they had gone to the right, and so I went to the left. And in this blind panic, and I was very foggy-headed and very weak. I was just stumbling. I felt like I was dying. I felt like I'm mortally wounded. So I'm struggling just in a blind sort of way. I gotta get out of here. I gotta get, I thought if I could just open a door, I could drop 15 feet to the ground and be back in the forest and breathe some good, fresh, oxygenated air. But I went right by a door on the left. I was just too panicked. I couldn't see far enough behind me to see if they were chasing me, because it curved so tightly I couldn't see very far ahead of me. So I was torn between afraid of what was behind me and what was ahead of me in this hysterical panic that I was in. So when I came to this door on the right and I looked in, I could see rectangles on the wall in there that I looked like doors, and I thought, open one of them, I could escape from this thing. I put together the floor plan here, not at that time. In hindsight, I can see that those doors wouldn't have opened to the outside, but at the time I was trying to open them, I was thinking I could escape through those. And so the only visible way of opening it, I couldn't see anything, no doorknob, no button, nothing that would open the door. So the chair in the middle of the room had buttons and controls on it. And assuming that one of them might open a door, I moved to the center of the room. And when I moved in that direction, the room would darken. And when I'd step back, it would lighten. You'd see the walls, and the closer you got to where the chair was, the more you could see these points of light all around. It was like a planetarium, points of light projected on the ceiling, floor, walls, or maybe some way of actually, not just a projected map, but actually seeing where this thing was. But in my panic, the only thing I was focused on is push these buttons, see if I could open one of the doors. There was a lever that moved these points of light, and that was real disorienting. I was already really unbalanced, feeling unsteady on my feet. So I didn't mess with that anymore, but I was thinking of pushing another button, and that's when the man came in. I immediately assumed, probably incorrectly, that this was a human being from some Earth-based agency like Air Force or military or something that was there to rescue me from these, quote, monsters. So I started just screaming, babbling all these questions, telling him about these creatures, and he didn't seem perturbed, didn't seem alarmed or anything, but he took me by the arm and led me out of there. I was only too happy to go, assuming this was a rescue. We went through a little short section of hallway I think was probably an airlock, because when we got out on the other side, it was much cooler, fresher, and so bright it hurt my eyes. But it wasn't out of doors, although it felt like out of doors air compared to the interior of that craft. But it was like a big room shaped like a quarter of a cylinder. The wall behind us curved up and came at a right angle into the far wall. So I don't know whether it was like an airplane hangar, a building somewhere, or a part of a larger craft. I tried to look around. I could see other disc-shaped craft that were more rounded than the one we came out of, 2 or maybe 3. But he seemed to be in a hurry and was sort of half dragging me along, and I was unsteady on my feet, sort of stumbling. And He took me out of this huge room down a hallway and into a room where there were some other people dressed like him. Now, you know, I wasn't too alarmed by his non-response. He wasn't answering my questions. But I thought with that helmet on, maybe he couldn't hear me clearly or couldn't speak with it on. But these other human-looking people in the room that he left me with weren't wearing helmets. So I, you know, regained renewed hope that somebody's going to tell me where I am, what's going on. So I started babbling. You know, I admit I was totally out of control, totally out of my mind with fear, even though, you know, I was away from these creatures that I'd just seen. The trauma of that whole experience was just fresh. And they weren't answering me. And they started moving me over towards this table, trying to put me down on the table. And so that's when I became alarmed that this wasn't a rescue, that I was still in deep trouble. So I started to resist, try to fight back. I was a very strong person at that time, but in a very weakened condition. But in spite of that, they felt very strong. And they were able to get me down. I was outnumbered, there was 3 of them, and put me down on the table. And one of them put a mask over my face, an oxygen mask-like thing. And in my panic, I was actually able to get one hand free and get my finger under the edge of it to try to pull it away from there. But before I could pull it away, I blacked out. And so the next thing I knew, I woke up. It was cold out. I was lying face down with my hand, my head on my arm and on a hard surface. And I could feel that my clothes were still warm, but the cold air was coming in, so I figured I hadn't been there too long. But the first thing I noticed was light was coming from above. And so I lifted my head up and looked in the direction of the light, and it went off before my eyes actually got to that point. But at that point, it was just this dark shape in the sky, blocking out a lot of the stars, and silvery chrome reflecting the center line of the highway. But it was there for just a second before it shot straight up. Didn't turn on its edge, didn't make a sound. There might have been some faint feeling of warmth from it, but I would be surprised why it wouldn't break the sound barrier the way a bullet cracks when it travels through the air. Aside from the explosion of the gunpowder, there's a sonic boom that would happen with something moving that fast, but it was very quickly gone from sight. I looked around and I could see the lights of the town down below that was quite recognizable. And I ran down and there was a building with lights on, smoke coming out of the chimney. I pounded on the door and yelled. Nobody came. But you got to think, in the middle of the night, who wants to come to the door when somebody's screaming like a maniac pounding on the door? They may have assumed I was crazy or drunk or something, or maybe nobody heard me or nobody was there. But I went on down across the second bridge and found the phone booths. And the phone booths are still there after all these years. They don't function anymore, but they were left there because the phone company knew about what had happened. Now, our famous UFO skeptic had some kind of theory that I was someplace else, but the fact that the operator listened in on the call illegally, but thankfully was able to confirm that that's where I was and not fitting into any other scenario that skeptics dreamed up. And she reported it to law enforcement, a deputy out there who arrived after my brother came and picked me up. When I made the call, my family had been receiving crank calls and were pretty tired of it. And my brother-in-law, Grant, thought this was another one. And he says, real sarcastic, like, I think you have a wrong number. And I said, no, it's me. I screamed, and somehow he knew by the urgency on my voice that this was really me. Not that weak voice that, out of breath that he'd heard at first. And so he was kind of hesitant. He says, okay, I'll get your brother and I'll come and get you. And as I hung up, I thought, my brother, he doesn't even live here. He lives in Phoenix. Because I was thinking this was still the same night, Wednesday. I didn't know how much time had gone by. But here I was calling my brother-in-law Grant, and coincidentally, at that moment was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald on the Great Lakes. Gordon Lightfoot sang a song about it. It was brought to my attention by a radio host that did an interview with me from up in that area. And he was saying that there was a number of UFO reports in connection with that shipwreck. And it was very mysterious that 29 people vanished. They never found any of them. They found the wreck, the boat, but even though that water was not that deep at that point, if you stood that ship on end, one end would have touched the bottom, the other end would be sticking out of the water. In spite of the fact that the Coast Guard was there almost immediately, they never found anyone. But also the coincidence is that one of the crewmen was named Grant Walton. And so it's just one of those amazing little coincidences that may mean nothing. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But after that, it was, people were desperate to explain this away any way they could. Before I was returned, the whole community was convinced that they had murdered me and made up a cover story. And so, the crew had taken a lot of abuse. Steve, even his own mom was suspecting he was in on something, covering up for maybe Alan getting carried away with a chainsaw and getting in a big fight. And so they called in the state police lie detector expert, tested the man. When they passed, the president of the American Polygraph Association said, polygraph's not 100%, it's in the 90-some percentile, repeatedly in research done, for many years. But when you have 6 people passing tests on the same issue, the odds are over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any kind of mistake. And that was with 6 tests. At this point, there's 16 or 17 past tests in connection with this incident. I've passed 5 different tests from 3 different examiners, all of whom of the highest credentials, law enforcement lie detector experts, because there are some other people that, do pre-employment tests and marital fidelity tests and stuff, but my tests were of the best credentials, and the most recent 2, just a few years ago, were with a firm that does testing for the New Mexico State Prison System, the Albuquerque Police Department, and the United States Marshals Service. So modern test is a newer 5-trace machine, had computer testing paralleling the examiner's scoring, the computer scoring, with all kinds of other video sensors. A very complex, refined testing, and that's not enough. It's never enough. Back when the crew had passed the test and everybody had passed, Dr. Harder made the point that 6 men testifying that they witnessed a murder would have been sufficient to convict someone of murder in an American court of law. And here you had 6 men saying they saw this UFO abduction, and all of a sudden people are going humming and hawing, even though they had polygraph tests on top of it. Without polygraph tests, 6 witnesses saying they witnessed a murder. So either we're administering the death penalty and setting the bar too low for that, or we're suddenly artificially raising the bar when it comes to witnesses of things like UFOs. People don't want to believe it. But why not? I'm sure fear is a big part of it. every year or so I get some kind of a crank call from some person that, you know, just blasting me. And when I dig into it, it's always a young male living in his parents' basement. And it's really about fear. Once I tell him, look, you have nothing to fear. First of all, I don't think they mean me any harm. And the odds of it happening to you are so low, it'd be like winning the lottery while holding a four-leaf clover and a rabbit's foot and being struck by lightning all on the same day, you know. The odds are very, very low. And that has actually turned these guys around in so many cases where they're actually kind of apologetic. And why you might wonder why I would waste my time on people like that, but I do realize that, you know, fear is a lot of what motivates people to resist this idea. We live on a planet going around a star. There's 9 other planets. You know, this is the modern world. We're quite aware, you know, NASA announced in the last year that virtually every star has about a dozen planets. They know that now. They know that because of the techniques that they've developed. They can't directly observe the planet in every case, but because of minor fluctuations in the amount of light being, some of it's blocked out as the planet passes in front of the star. And based on these calculations, they're actually able to identify dozens of stars that not only they know they have planets, but they know that they're possibly Earth-like because of the size and the position, the distance from the star. If it's too far out, it's too cold. If it's too close, it's too hot. And so here in the modern world, the flat earthers need to know, and by flat earthers I mean the skeptics. Here we live in a universe where they know there's billions of stars, literally billions, in our galaxy alone. When you look at the night sky, most of those points of light you see out there are not individual stars. Check your astronomy text. Most of those are actually entire galaxies. Our galaxy is the Milky Way galaxy, and we have billions of stars here. And if virtually every one of those has a dozen planets, then multiply the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy by 10, and that's the number of planets. I mean, the odds become just gigantic, mind-numbing in the volume of planets that are likely to be Earth-like and life-supporting. People that act like, oh, it's just such a crazy idea to think that there could be life somewhere else. Give me a break. It's crazy to think there isn't. You know, so the science has switched. Back when this happened, people who believed that there was life on other worlds and that they could possibly come here were considered kooks. Well, now it's the skeptics who are the kooks. Because if the definition of a kook is someone who believes something at odds with what most people believe and with what most scientists believe, that's a kook. Well, the truth is, most scientists do acknowledge the likelihood of life out there. And the surveys show that the proportion of the population that believes that this could be true is, you know, approaching 50% and higher, you know, in these polls. So it's them who are the kooks. They're believing something in the absence of evidence to support it. They believe, as an affirmative statement, that there isn't no UFOs. None of this is true. Well, I think it's always important for us to be upfront about the idea that not every report is an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Occasionally people do mistake meteors and balloons and whatnot, but the skeptics always act like if they can find one case that is college students with a prank, you know, that basically sums up their explanation for the whole phenomenon. And that's not true. So we got to get away from the idea that it's all true, because it's not all true. And we got to get away from the idea that if any of it can be disproven, that it's all disproven. That's a kind of a dumb way to approach it that the skeptics have adopted. So There's a lot of ongoing research here. The tree nearest where the departing craft that brought me back was leaving, I'm looking at that and possibly core sampling it, if we can do that in a way that doesn't kill the tree. It's not looking too healthy. It's been 40 years. And if it does die, then that might be an opportunity to examine the growth rings of that tree. It was exposed to the presence of a different type of craft, but we might find confirmation that that's sort of a universal effect of these things. There's all kinds of ongoing research on the site. We did magnetic scans and charted out the area and mapped that out. It's amazing. After 40 years, we've got more. But I'm going to start opening it up to questions because I haven't covered everything. I never do because there's just too much in the allotted time to tell you everything in relation to this. I tried to hit the high points so we could get to some of these questions. And I really like the questions because it's amazing that, again, after all this time, people come up with ideas that nobody ever thought of. So,
Travis, excuse me a minute. Because this is being filmed, we're going to ask folks to come up to this microphone, which will be down here on the left, and address your question into the microphone so we can get it on our video.
don't be shy. So, we got follow-up medical testing going on. There's, interesting things that need to be looked into. I've been reluctant to come out with some things that draw too much attention to myself, and especially if I can't document it. If I can't document it, I'm not going to talk about it yet. So I went into my employer and got the printout, the proof that I never called in sick in the last 40 years. And, it could be a coincidence. Maybe it's just good genetics or, that I try to live a healthy life. But it could be a effect of some of the repairs that they were doing that just reviving me and trying to correct what happened when that blast of energy hit me might have had some beneficial side effects. But I want to look into that medically. Come on, somebody's got a question. There's the mic. All right, Joe, let's hear it.
You can just repeat the question.
Yeah, if someone is unable to get up quickly and get to the mic, you just call out the question, then I'll repeat it, and it'll get on film that way. What?
Yes, my name is Bill. I'm from Paul Poag Theater. I saw the movie in San Angelo back when it came out. In the movie, of course, it showed the aliens when they hanging on that table. Those aliens, of course, looked downstairs. But the other ones looked more human. Like, why wasn't that shown in the movie?
Well, in the movie, they had the actor held down by this membrane, and he's struggling to breathe through it and covering his mouth. And that didn't happen, but if you were to just show that I was looking panicked and breathing hard, you wouldn't really get the connection. It really does a better job of showing that the feeling of suffocation was generating the panic. Everybody can identify with that when you show that membrane over my face. And that scene right there where I wake up with the three aliens around me was made into a commercial that came out right after the movie came out. It was for Airwalk shoes. And if you want to see this commercial, you can go on YouTube and see it. It's pretty popular. This redheaded guy is driving down this highway, and he passes a sign that says Roswell 10 miles or something. And all of a sudden he sees a UFO. And the scene where the lights come down across his windshield are identical to the scene where James Garner pulls up to the railroad crossing, and he's looking like that, and you see those lights come across the windshield, and then it's just a train going by. And it's kind of a false alarm for James Garner. Well, that scene was copied into that commercial. And so the next thing you know, the driver of the car, the car sputters to a stop. He's lying there on the highway. First he wakes up, and he's on board the craft, and the aliens are standing around him, and he looks down, and they're tugging at his shoes. And so he wakes up, looks at his feet. There's just his socks, no shoes. They abducted his Airwalk shoes. And so if you want to look at that commercial, it's kind of funny because it inspired this commercial.
I got another question.
Go ahead.
It's a real traumatic event that you went through, and I believe it 100%. Did it ever give you psychological problems or anything that you got to deal with today?
Well, that's a good question. You know, some people come to me and say, you know, can you help me deal with this? You know, this is very traumatic for me. And they'll ask me advice about, you know, should I undergo regressive hypnosis? Should I find out if what I suspect happened to me really did happen to me? And I tell people, you know, it's a really individual decision. You gotta consider, how will this affect me if I know for sure? Will I be able to handle it? And if I find out, would I want to tell anyone at all? Or would I want to go public? You gotta consider how those around you might feel, you know, your family and coworkers and whatnot. And I've been urged by some people to write a book just about how do you cope with this stuff. I recently got a book on PTSD, you know. I'm kind of looking into the idea of writing up some things about at least the techniques that I used to cope with it. And there was no support groups like there are now, you know, Barbara Lamb and the Experiencers Speak, and some of these groups are just about dealing with the emotional impact and how to cope with the stress of the memories and of relating to people that you're trying to explain what happened to you. So I'm seriously considering trying to help out in that way.
But do you ever dream about it too?
Well, for weeks and months, you know, the nightmares with those staring eyes was the main thing. But gradually, once those faded away, or at least I quit remembering them. My wife at the time would say, you know, you were growling and fighting in your sleep. And I'd say, I don't remember, you know. But even that went away. And about the time that they were making the movie, this was, 15 years after it happened, I started having more dreams about the human-looking ones. Sort of a much better, peaceful sort of a feeling, a friendly feeling. But I went to Tracy Torme, a screenwriter on Fire in the Sky, and I asked him, do you think that these could be like memories that are coming back to me, little glimpses, glimmers, leaking back? And he goes, nah, it's probably just, you know, because you're doing so many interviews now coming up to the movie. But I asked him about that here recently, and he had the whole exact opposite opinion. He says, oh no, it's probably memories that are coming back to you. So I got both opinions on that one. But, you know, here after 40 years, you'd think that other 5 days would have come back to me, but nothing. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
In the movie, it shows you waking up in some sort of like pod or something.
Oh, that was just totally Hollywood. Yeah. And you know what happened towards the end of the movie, filming of the movie? There was a television series depicting the Greys. At that time, it wasn't understood that this is one of the most common species types that is coming here. And Brandon Tartikoff was the head of Paramount at the time, and he was alarmed that the movie was being undercut because he wanted to show the public something they had never seen. What do they look like? That's the most common question I get. What do they look like? People are so interested in what they look like. But, you know, some of them look like us. It's just that there's many different types. And it's my opinion that, you see, Michio Kaku was on television, and he said, you know, people keep imagining that these beings are maybe a few hundred years ahead of us. He says, but if you understand astronomy, you know that these star systems can be thousands or millions of years older than ours. And therefore, space travel could have been going on for so many millennia that the home planet is no longer it. I mean, they've expanded out, they've colonized other planets and actually changed into different types, or independently arising a very similar looking being Just like the case of these human-looking beings, they didn't necessarily create us or be a representative of us in the future or us in the past. It could actually be that the kinds of conditions that bring about life is going to bring about similar life. I got a whole lot of thinking. I've done 40 years of thinking about that. But back to your original question.
With your experience and the trauma that you face, have you met others who have went through similar experiences and coming across aliens?
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't ever comment on particular cases. You know, in the opening of my book, I said, condemnation without investigation is the height of ignorance. That was a quote from Emerson. And I also say, the biggest criticism I have from my critics is, you know, this is an extraordinary account, and, you know, people need to have a reason to believe it. That's the reason we do medical testing, polygraph testing, and this kind of follow-up research, is to help people understand that this is real. But at the same time, I said, you know, initial curiosity or wondering whether it's true, you know, I don't value people who just say, well, I know it's true without looking at the facts, any more than I value the opinion of people who say, that can't be true, and they've never looked at the facts. You know, like our famous UFO skeptic there in the video, he was attacking the case when he thought we were riding in a car and there was only 3 people in the car. He knew so little about it, he was already trying to undercut it by looking up where Jupiter was at the time and stuff like that. So what I said was, before you pass judgment on any of these cases, get the facts first. Base your opinion on the facts. And just because someone has an experience that they can't document as well as I've been able to, doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means that if you want to know if something's true, you really do have to have a basis for that. Now, very often at these kind of events, somebody will come up to me and they start rattling off all this stuff. And my question is, how do you know that? And like they'll say, there's 17 species visiting Earth. Okay, where did you get that? Who cataloged them? Who knows just exactly how many there are? How do you know they're not 23 or 14? You know, you have to have a basis to believe in the positive. This is true. I think this is a good case. But that doesn't mean cases that lack that kind of proof are untrue. That's what the skeptics try to tell us. If the unproven is the exact equivalent of the disproven in their mind. And that's not the way science works. That's not the way even the legal system works. When a person is accused of a crime and they're found not guilty, that is not the same as a verdict of innocent. Not guilty means we couldn't prove you did it. Innocent means we proved you didn't do it. You know, you were somewhere else or whatever. It's black and white and shades of gray, and these skeptics don't think that way. They absolutely equate the unproven as therefore disproven, and that's a very ignorant kind of way to think. Thank you.
Well, Travis, I'm Monty Learwood from San Antonio, Texas. And I have a question, a couple of questions. My first question is, I read somewhere or heard some video somewhere saying that there was actually 2 independent witnesses from the set.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. Actually, there was more than that, but the ones we can document are when we got a hold of the sheriff's file on this. He had various campers, hunters, and fishermen in the area that saw the craft pass over at that time. But the most significant case was this guy that was deer hunting with his wife. He was on the next ridge, and when he called me up, he was describing the surrounding terrain. I knew he had to have been there to know this. But he said because he was in the military at the time that he consulted with his superiors about coming forward. He says, these guys are accused of murder, shouldn't I come forward in their behalf? And he said his superiors said, unless they're indicted, stay out of it. But he was in military intelligence. Well, I told Tracy Torme about it, and I didn't think anything more about this. It was right before the Larry King show. But I found out later that they flew him out to Hollywood, interviewed him, and they wanted to verify what he was saying. So they gave him lie detector tests from the state police lie detector expert that tested the crew. He was in private practice now. And very interesting. He took 2 tests. One of them was about being where he said he was, seeing the glow of the craft, the blast, the flash of the beam, and he passed. But when they tested him about being having contact with this UFO skeptic and his group of people, he flunked. Right. No, yeah. Did he have contact with Phil Klass in that group? And he denied it and was lying. So it was very strange that a man from military intelligence is on the next hill with a high-powered rifle, and yet he's had connection with these debunkers. What was up with that? I found out, I met a guy at a swap meet that said that he was a member of some patriot group in the Phoenix area, and that this guy had come there and was infiltrating that group, getting to know everybody, and even though he was freely talking about his being in the area when that incident happened. And yet here he is with this militia kind of freedom patriot group. So odd. But anyway, he was saying at the time that his wife was hunting with him and that she would vouch for the story even though they were now divorced. Highly credible that he was there, but very suspicious about what he was doing and why he called me right before the Larry King show. So I kind of think that maybe he was there because the government was monitoring UFO activity in that area. They had him there for that reason, and he saw what he saw, but then his job was to somehow come on as a star witness and then somehow damage the case or create ridicule or doubt in some way. So that's just my suspicion. I don't have any proof other than that he flunked when he was asked if he had connection with the debunkers. And I didn't get to that, that through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to find a memo written by J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, and sent to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, basically describing the case against Phil Klass and turning the matter over to them. And see, this is standard CIA recruiting tactic, is to get something you can hold over somebody's head, a prosecutable offense, in this case, revealing classified information in connection with his job at Aerospace and Space Technology magazine, and then decline to prosecute and then gain their cooperation. I don't think they turned him into a UFO skeptic, but they found him useful, and I think that's where the $10,000 came from. See, Phil Klass offered Steve Pierce, one of the crew members, $10,000 to discredit the case. He does not make that kind of money as a magazine editor. And we have proof that the bribe was offered. It was carried by the local deputy in Taylor, Jim Click, and delivered to Steve. And when I made it public that this bribe offer had been made, there was no denial from Philip Klass. He later tracked Steve down when Steve changed his name and moved to Texas. I don't know how he found him, but again, pushing him to take the $10,000 bribe. And that's the kind of money that he could get from his handlers at the CIA or whatever agency he was turned over to. But there were other witnesses, and some of them were not military intelligence people, just hunters and campers and people who were in that area at that time. Yeah, Yeah, they actually saw it pass over. And these reports were taken by the sheriff and put into the file, which mysteriously disappeared.
My second question is from my neighbor, Nancy Alanis. She wanted to be here. She wanted to ask you this question, so I thought I'd ask it for her. When you saw the human-looking beings, you said their eyes were different. What do you mean by their eyes looking different?
Well, I was working with an artist, and I was doing my best. We were looking through magazines, and they looked kind of like this person and this person. I was trying to get it, like a police sketch artist, trying to say a composite, well, this kind of a chin, this kind of a forehead, and this kind of stuff. But when it came to the eyes, there was just something odd about their eyes that I never quite could put my finger on. I think if I saw one of those people here, I'd recognize that. But I don't think anybody here would say, oh, that doesn't look human. It's not that outstanding. It was just something, when I was laying there on the table and I was fighting and I'm looking at him, I'm screaming at him, I could see him kind of wince when I was particularly loud, screaming. But there was something in the eye that was odd. I don't know what it was.
And I would also want to echo what you said. You said that just because you're found not guilty doesn't mean you're guilty. I work for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission when it comes to discrimination in the workplace, and I tell the people that file charges that we'll investigate your case, but we may not be able to prove it. That doesn't mean you weren't discriminated against. That just means we couldn't prove it and we didn't do right.
Two separate things, and people need to get that, especially the skeptics, that the unproven doesn't mean disproven. And all you got to do is be real stubborn. Well, that's not enough proof to convince me. Well, if you want to take that attitude, then, that T-shirt I got out there. For those who refuse to believe, no amount of evidence is ever enough. For those who experience it, no more proof is necessary. Hello.
I was just wondering, over the years, has anything ever happened to you or made you feel as if they're keeping tabs on you or they might come back for you in some way?
If anything more was to happen that I couldn't prove, I might not report it. I had one other incident happen that, because I had some people with me, I can tell you about. Jan Harzan was speaking at a MUFON meeting in Burbank. That's the head of MUFON. Tracy Torme spoke there. This was February before last, or maybe the year before that. And I was there with my son and a girlfriend. And when we left, we were driving up the 5 towards the 10 in LA. And we saw these lights coming towards us, and it very quickly became clear that this was a giant black triangle. I mean, this thing was huge, and it came right at us, and it sort of tipped up as it got right above us. This was in February. Pardon, what was the question?
If anything happened to you, or would you feel like they're keeping tabs on you or might come back for you?
Well, like I say, if I can't prove it, I'm not going to talk about it. There's been a lot of talk about people who have legitimate experiences, and then sometimes they become sort of intoxicated by the attention, and then they start to embellish what was once a real event. And it's unfortunate, but pretty soon it gets wilder and wilder because people are trying to, embellish what had happened before. And even one of my own crew members has kind of become intoxicated by the attention. And so I don't ever want to fall into that trap, and I'll stick to what I can document, what I can prove.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering if whenever you were in the woods and you got hit by a beam of light, did you think that they were specifically choosing you, or they were interested in you because of the movie you did?
Well, one of the crew members, maybe two of them, think that I was chosen, that they were waiting for us. But, I've kind of shied away from that explanation because You know, Steve says, well, they picked Travis because he's like this and like that, you know, but, you know, that seems kind of like I'm special. So I never wanted to look at it that way. I kind of leaned with the explanation that the screenwriter had, is that I just did something very unexpectedly, got myself hurt, and then they had to take me aboard to avoid having this be, you know, it would have gone down in history as, you know, man killed by UFO, you know, the galactic roadkill kind of a joke, you know. So I created a bad situation for them and they had to fix it, but it was my fault. So I look at it that way. Thank you. Well, somebody going to think of a question after we adjourn, so try to, if you want them to just call out your question, I can repeat it here, and if you're shy about getting up to the microphone.
Have you been diagnosed with cancer?
I have not been diagnosed with cancer. I have had absolutely no medical problems at all.
Travis, the ship on Paranormal Witness, is that more or less what the ship looks like? Or?
Well, on Paranormal Witness, they did an extraordinary job. They even found a 1965 International Crew Cab, which even Fire in the Sky, the Paramount movie, didn't do. But when they depicted the craft, they showed it spinning. It did not spin. And that was one defect. I said that Paranormal Witness episode, that 90-minute special, was the best that's been done out of dozens of shows that have been done on it. But nobody ever gets it perfect. But they pushed at it in the interview tactic. You see, none of us got together. All those interviews with all the crew members, they were done separately, some of them in different states. I never talked to them and they didn't talk to me. But, you know, when they were interviewing me, I thought they were trying to make us look bad. I was real suspicious about the technique because they were trying to make me relive it. And it was painful. But that comes out on film, and you can see the way every one of those guys broke down after nearly 40 years. It still is that powerfully affecting. So I give them a lot of credit for the depth and quality of that production, even though, like I say, none of it's perfect as far as, you know, it would take a huge budget to get it that exact. The craft did not spin. And you had a question.
The story in California, you and your son were driving in that black triangle.
Okay, she wanted me to finish the story about the black triangle. It stopped right over the top of us, and I could see very clearly because it was very low, very huge. It was just awesome, the size of this thing. And I couldn't see how something traveling that fast could stop that suddenly, because it's not aerodynamic. An airplane cannot do that. Whatever was powering it is something completely different. And it stopped, and I was looking up into these lights at the corners, and they had a sort of a shimmering look that I really, you know, my own personal theory is the look was that those were actually some kind of propulsion unit, something, not just lights like, you know, don't run into me with your airplane kind of a thing, but actually the, you know, propulsion units of the craft. I could describe that, those lights on the corners in greater detail. But my son was driving, I was a passenger, and my girlfriend was in the back. And she said, looking up through the window as it passed above us, that you could, she could actually see the skin of it, a very flat black. But it turned right over the top of us and then headed off towards the west. And I thought, we're over a city of millions, and this thing isn't front page news tomorrow? You know, people just don't look up, you know, assuming that it wasn't seen by me. Online, and he found this website that I'd never heard of. It's called UFOstalker.com. And it's set up kind of like Google Maps. There's actually a map of these locations, and they put the sighting in a little circle with a number. And he found that about a dozen people had found this little obscure website and reported seeing the same thing at the same time and space spot as that. But I thought it was very strange that it was stopping over the top of us. you know. And we're in a city of millions, and it stops and turns and goes off to the west. Right after we leave a MUFON meeting, I don't know, maybe it's just a coincidence, but it was really strange. Right back here.
How long were you missing?
I was missing for 5 days and 6 hours, but you know, when my brother commented about how worried my mother had been, I go, what? You know, I thought this was still the same night. So that's when it started to, you know, that would hit me pretty hard that I'd been gone that long. And you had What happened to the truck? Well, eventually it was sold, and you know, I don't know, it probably went to a scrapyard. It was already well past its prime. I wish it had, you know. It was ridiculous. When Mike was talking to that guy with the Geiger counter, he said, well, test the truck. And the guy just acted mad, rolled up his sensor and stomped off. Now, he may have come back and tested it when the men weren't looking, but he was really annoyed by the fact that they were present while he was doing this testing. Now, you know, what I suspected, what Mike suspected, it was these were actually, you know, federal government people in disguise, just wearing a Forest Service uniform to blend in. The lady, Joe Baez, was a reporter at the local White Mountain Independent, the newspaper. She was doing volunteer work at the fire tower, a Deer Springs Lookout Tower, the following summer. And a crew of government men came by with these instruments, and they were measuring magnetic readings on the ground. Now, normally this mapping is done from the air. They suspend the instrument under an airplane, just fly a crisscross pattern. You know, you can you know, hook into the GPS and make a precise grid flying back and forth, and make readings about what the magnetic readings are. So that there was suspicion that that was a follow-up ordered by the government in response to this incident, because there was UFO investigators who came out there during the search, and they had 2 Gauss meters, Model 25S, and, you know, the 2 different ones, and they took readings around the clearing, gridded it off, and charted it out, and put it in the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization's file. And they found high magnetic readings with an actual pole reversal in the direction that the craft had left. And this became public knowledge. And so therefore, there was a follow-up, I think, by the government sending that crew out there. We'll take another question, and then we'll wrap it up.
My name is San Antonio, Texas. Now that you mentioned the triangular aircraft, I was wondering if any diagnostic tests were ever done to determine what it had.
I had upper body x-rays. The question was there ever a test done to see if I had implants? The upper body x-rays did not reveal anything like that. Although I imagine with their technology that if they wanted to, there would be means of tracking without a visible device, or then they might be able to implant something that would be undetectable with our standard, rather primitive methods of examination. I really appreciate you coming. This has been really interesting, a great bunch of people. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for your